Welcome to my complete Next.js 15 course for beginners. In just under 2 hours, you'll learn everything you need to know to get started with Next.js and build your own web applications. For those who aren't familiar, Next.js is a powerful React framework that enables you to create dynamic, server-rendered web apps with ease. Whether you're building a static blog, a complex web application, or an e-commerce platform, Next.js provides the tools and optimizations to streamline your development process. It's known for its fast performance, automatic page rendering, and built-in routing system. In this course, we're going to cover everything from setting up a Next.js project, managing pages and routing with the new app router, implementing dynamic routes, handling data fetching with server-side rendering, and much more. Before we jump in, if you want to learn React in a very easy and structured way, check out my new React.js course for beginners. This course will take you from a complete beginner to advanced in the exact way that led me to go from a complete beginner to getting my dream job. So if you're interested in checking out, we are still in early bird pricing. So if you go to react.pedrotech.co or click the link in the description and use the code EARLY100, you will get 20% off. The price for this course will never be this cheap, so I highly recommend that if you're interested, go check it out. And now that I got that out of the way, let's get started. Now that you know why you need to learn Next.js, let's learn how to create your first Next.js project. So in order for you to create yours, you'll want to open a folder inside of your code editor of choice. In my case over here, I'm using VS Code, and I open up a project inside of a folder called Next.js course. So what I want to do is I want to open up our terminal over here. And if, of course, we're assuming here you've probably worked with a React project in the past, you might be experienced with using different build tools to generate your React application. Remember, a Next.js app is a React application, but offers a lot of extra features that a normal React app wouldn't. So you will want to build your Next.js app by using one of those build tools. The build tool we're going to be using is create next app. So to do that, you want to run npx create next app. Now, if you don't use npm, you use pnpm or yarn or any other package manager out there, feel free to use the command, will work just the same. Now, if you've never ran this command before, you might be prompted with needing to install it, but obviously I've had in the past, so I just got prompted with being asked, what is your project name? Now you can give a name of your choice over here, but I already am inside of a folder, as you can see, called Next.js course. So I basically just want to build my project inside of the folder that I'm already inside of. So I'll put just a dot, which will basically create the project in the same directory I'm already inside of. So then it will ask us, do we want to use TypeScript? And I highly recommend using TypeScript. Next.js is created for you to be building apps for production, and if you're going to be pushing any code to production, I highly recommend you using TypeScript. Now, if you've never learned TypeScript in the past, you can still watch this course because there won't be a lot of differences between the code that we write in JavaScript and TypeScript, since this course is primarily focused on the Next.js features. However, highly recommend you just press enter and it will automatically install TypeScript in the project for you. Then it's going to ask us for ESLint, which if you're not familiar with ESLint is basically an analysis tool that will tell you if you are writing code that follows some sort of anti-pattern, or for example, you import something and never use it, or you make minor mistakes that would be considered, in my opinion, kind of grammatical mistakes in your code. And it definitely is a required package for you to have if you're going to be deploying anything to production, just because it increases overall your code quality. So I'm going to put yes to that as well. Then it will ask us if we want to use Tailwind CSS. So more and more with how the industry is going, Tailwind is becoming a staple in the industry. If you don't know Tailwind, we're not going to be doing any styling in this video, so it wouldn't matter at all. However, I would recommend you learning Tailwind, and for that reason, we're going to put yes so that it automatically sets up Tailwind for us in its latest version. Then it's going to ask us if we want to put our code inside of a source directory. Now, this is up to you, but I prefer to not, and you'll see that most people prefer to not as well. That's why it defaults to no automatically. But feel free to do so if you want to, since a lot of projects out there in other languages and other frameworks do use the source as the directory where your code goes into. So I'm going to put no. Then it's going to ask us if we want to use the app router, and it specifically says it's recommended. So we'll obviously go over this, but Next.js has two different formats of routing, right? We're not using the generic React Router DOM or even other better options for client-side routing like 10-stack router. In Next.js, we have something called file-based routing, which is crucial for how Next.js works. And in the previous versions, we had something called the page router, which you don't need to learn anymore because the app router is the latest version. It is the recommended version, and in my opinion, is one of the biggest improvements that Next.js has had in its latest versions. So if you're watching a tutorial and they use the pages router, you will immediately recognize it, and I'll obviously mention to you guys in this course if we get to that stage. Now, TurboPack is a bundler that will be built into our app, and it is supposed to significantly increase the efficiency and speed of your development. So we are going to put it for yes. Then would you like to customize your import alias? To be honest, no, I like to use the @ symbol by default. And what that means is no matter where you are in your app, you can just import and put this as a replacement for your root directory, and it will make importing stuff way easier. So we're going to put no because we want to keep it as default. So when we finish that, it will start setting up our project. Now you see it is installing a bunch of dependencies over here, and this is great because it does everything for us without having to worry about anything. And as you can see over here, we are it's already setting up all of the different packages and folders that we need in our project, and it is installing all of the dependencies. So as you can see in the end, it says success, we created our project. So I'm gonna close out our terminal and let's go over what a Next.js project look like. Now, I think this is an important thing to actually spend some time talking about because if you never worked on a Next.js project in the past, you might be confused or overwhelmed with the structure of it. However, there's something that I love about Next.js, which is the fact that if you've worked on a Next.js project in the past, you'll be able to get familiar with any other Next.js project just because there is a very standard way for you to build your applications that is commonly used between everyone who build in Next.js. So if you spend 10 minutes of this video learning the folder structure and learning how to actually set up your application in Next.js, you will be able to read and understand any other Next.js project. So I'll really go in depth on what each of these initial files represent and folders represent in the initial setup of the create next app command. So let's start off with the basics. We'll go from the bottom up. We have here the tsconfig.json, and this isn't a Next.js specific file. It is just a configuration file for TypeScript. And like I said, since we are recommending to use TypeScript in every project, we want to keep it as strict equal to true, meaning that it will enforce all of the different TypeScript checks in our application. But the basics is that our tsconfig.json just helps us configure anything related to TypeScript in our application, so it doesn't actually differ or relate to anything really that is different from Next.js. The second thing, I'm going to skip the README. The second thing is the post CSS. This is specifically because we are using Tailwind. So if you're not using Tailwind, this won't matter at all. So then we have our package.json. So in our package.json, we see that it is like any other package.json, but when you have your scripts, we have a couple commands that are important when we are developing in Next.js. So the first one is the dev script. So we've set up this Next.js app, but if we want to develop in it, we need to run it inside of our local host. So to do that, we want to run npm run dev. This will trigger the dev command over here, the dev script, and it will run our Next.js server in development mode. Because we set it up with TurboPack, we have the TurboPack flag enabled, which means that it will enable TurboPack, making use of this bundling tool that will make your development performance be a lot faster. So you see over here that our app should be running perfectly. I am already running another thing that is unrelated to this video on port 3000, but your project should be running on port 3000. Mine is going to be running on port 3001. But again, if you are not running anything on the port 3000, yours should be running there. Now, how do we check this? Well, I'm going to open up here my browser, and I'm just going to go to localhost 3001. And if everything works, we should see the starter page for our Next.js app. Now, if we go back over here, I'll continue talking about our package.json. So we have the build command over here, which like in any other package.json, it builds the project for production. This will prepare the application for when we deploy it by optimizing the code. Now, the start will start the application in actual production mode. So we develop with the dev script, but the start command is only for production. Basically, when we deploy this, the project is going to run an npm build and then an npm start to actually start the server. Now we have a lint over here, and because we set up ESLint, this lint command will basically check for all of your code for any linting issues related to style, related to syntax, related to anything. So if you ever want to know if your code looks nice, just run npm run lint, and it will give you suggestions about your code and find any issues with it. Now we get into the dependencies. The major dependencies obviously are React, React DOM, and Next. And like I said, a Next project is a React project, and for that reason we need React DOM and React. Also keep in mind that I'm already using React 19 because Next.js already supports it. And if you're watching this course in the future, I'm using Next.js 15, and Next.js changes a lot in each of its versions. So I highly recommend that you follow the video, keeping in mind that we are using Next.js 15. Now, there's a bunch of dab dependencies over here, and they don't really matter for me to go really in depth. It's just TypeScript and other dependencies related to Tailwind and type definitions and stuff. So I'll close our package.json, and we will go to the next.config.ts, which is the first Next.js specific file that you've seen in this course. Now, the main purpose for this file is that it will be a configuration file for your Next.js application. Similar to how if you are using Vite, for example, there's a Vite config file. If you are using TypeScript, there's a tsconfig file. And even with ESLint, there's a config file. Every single package that you use will probably have some sort of configuration file for you to adapt to your project. And in a Next.js project, you do that in your next.config.ts. Maybe in the beginning, you won't really do anything here, but with time, you will see the power of it. So in here, things you can do is you can set up your custom Webpack configurations, add any environment variables that you might want to add here, enable or disable certain features, like for example, image optimization, which we'll get to, and even customizing other Next.js settings. For example, if there's any experimental features in Next.js that aren't stable yet, you can actually test them in your project by specifying it over here. Now, like I said, we won't be doing much here because this is more for when you have a specific use case, you would actually make a difference here. But in the beginning, you won't be doing anything. Now, the next-env.d.ts is just a file that is a declaration file for TypeScript, and it's automatically generated when you set up a Next.js project with TypeScript. You don't touch on this file. This shouldn't be edited. This is just for automatically creating the TypeScript type definitions in your project. Now, the ESLint, again, I'm not going to touch this. This is just for ESLint configuration. But one cool thing is that you have here your .gitignore, which includes a bunch of the generic things that you might want to ignore if you were to push your code to a Git repository, including your .env files, which is something that is nice to have it already set up, because if I were to create here a .env file or a .env.local file, which by the way I recommend having, you see that they're grayed out, meaning that they are automatically not going to be included when you're pushing your code, making it easier for you to never leak your credentials. So now we get into the folders. These are the important, really important ones, with the exception of the node modules, which is present in every other JavaScript project. So what is the public folder? Now, the public folder means a lot of things in different projects. In React and in Next, it is pretty much the same thing. It will contain static files that can be served directly to the client. What do I mean by that? A lot of people don't understand what this means. When I create a Next.js project, I highly recommend that if you're going to put an image or an SVG or anything, you put it here in the public folder, because it'll make it a lot easier for you to directly import this into your project. Also, it makes it accessible through the URL. So we have here, for example, a bunch of SVGs, right? If I wanted to see what the globe.svg image is on my URL, it is perfectly accessible by just saying globe.svg. And you'll see that the SVG will appear. Same thing with the next.svg. I could say next.svg, and then that SVG would appear. So when you are creating adding an image or some sort of static file into your project, always add it to the public folder. Next thing is the .next folder. I'm gonna just skip the app for a second, but the .next folder, this is again generated on build. It is where it's going to contain the build and cache files for your Next.js app. So it's not really important. It's internal. It won't go to Git when you push it. It's just while you're developing, and you shouldn't really touch on this at all. Now we finally get to the app folder, which is your entire app. This is where your app is gonna exist in, and it is where you're going to be developing. Now, right off the bat, here are the 4 major core files that you're gonna have in your app folder. You have the favicon.ico, which basically every time you wanna set up the favicon, like this little icon on your website, you put the icon over here and you name it favicon.ico, or you can also name it icon.ico. If you want to put an image over here, just paste it onto your app folder, delete the current favicon.ico, and just name that image favicon.ico, and it will automatically set it to the icon here in the browser tab. Now, the second thing is the globals.css. This is the main CSS file for your project. Again, we're using Tailwind by default. So if you're using Tailwind, you have to start with the @import tailwind.css. But here is where, if you were to use Tailwind, you would define your themes, your colors, your different classes, and so on. But in general, it's just your CSS file for your project. Now, here is where our project actually starts. So we have a layout.tsx and a page.tsx. They are non-negotiable. The layout.tsx is where you build the actual HTML document for your project, right? And you insert the different components that you build in your Next React application inside of it. So we have here a root layout. It's a function that is exported, as you can see, and you shouldn't change the name, you shouldn't touch on it. The only thing you can do with it is whatever you put on the return. So I could technically put my name here, right? And it would appear on the document because we just added inside of the body, right? Everything you add in here will have effect on the UI. But this is just the HTML document that you build your Next app inside of, and you render all of the components inside of this children. Now, what are the children? Well, the children are dependent on the route of your app. So which route you're in, this will change, right? It depends on which page you're in. So we are initially in the main page, right? Because we don't have any extension to this route. But if we went to the about page, this children here would change and render whatever the component is to render in the about page. Now, we haven't gotten to routing yet, but this is how this would work. Now, in the layout, the cool thing is that every change that you put outside of this children over here would affect every single route. So for example, if I were to add here a p tag that says hello, right? And I'm in the main route, it appears at the top over here. But if I go to another route, even if it doesn't exist, but if I go to another route, this won't really work right now because we don't have that route, but it would appear here as well on top of the component that is rendered on this route. So this over here appears no matter what. Now, other important things on the layout is you can define fonts and so on for your project, but also you can define metadata. I will go extremely in depth about metadata later on in this course, but it's one of the main benefits of Next.js, right? Is the point that you can improve your SEO by server-side rendering your components and adding directly your metadata to each of your pages. So I won't talk about it right now, but just note that whatever you put inside of this metadata variable over here on your layout is going to be the metadata for your entire app. So now let's close the layout over here and let's go to the page.tsx. Now the page.tsx is the main route. This is where we put the route that shows up, the UI that shows up when you go into our URL without any other routes. Now, inside of here, you see we have a bunch of things, right? We have a component, which is called home, right? But the important thing here is that the name of this component doesn't really matter. I can call it whatever, and it will still work. It will still show up because Next.js uses something called file-based routing. And what that is that if I want to create a new route in my application, all I have to do is I have to come inside of our app folder over here. And imagine I want to create the about folder. I just click on new folder. I go to about, and inside of here, I create a page.tsx. Now, what this means is any component I export in this page.tsx will be shown into the screen when we go to the about route. This about route name over here is directly correlated to whatever we name this folder, meaning that if we want to create a new route, literally just create a new folder. I could make one over here and call it the contact route. And now if I go to contact, it won't show an error. It shows an error because there's nothing in the file yet, but that route exists. So that's how you set up a route in Next.js. But to actually render any UI, you have to export default function and you call a component. Now I called it about, but like I said, for the page over here, the home, it doesn't matter what you call the component. It just matters that you're exporting it and that the name of the file is page.tsx and the name of the folder is the name of the route you want to create. But inside of here, I'll just return a div that would just say about page. And then I'll save this. And you should see that now in the about route, we have an about page. Awesome. Now I can do the exact same thing here on the contact page. And if I actually change this to contact and this to contact page, just like this, we now should be able to go to the contact route and be able to see that UI being rendered here as well. Awesome. Now we know how to create different routes, and each of these routes are being rendered inside of the children over here in the layout. Now, how do I navigate between all of the different routes? Well, we can make a simple navbar. So I'm actually going to zoom out over here, and I'm going to create here a small navbar. And where do I want to put that navbar? Well, let's think about it. I want this navbar to appear in every single route, no matter which route you're in. I want it to appear over here at the top. So to do that, I'll go to the layout.tsx file, because remember, this applies to every single route. And in here, we can make a div that will represent the navbar. Now, if I go over here to our homepage, the navbar text appear on the top. But if I go to the about page, it will continue appear on the top. Same thing with the contact page, it will continue appear on the top because it is outside of the children over here and thus appears on every single part of the layout. So in here, let's put a link to all of the different routes. So to put a link, normally you would use an A tag, but in Next.js, you would want to use the link component from Next link. This component is very simple to use. You call the component, you put a label to show up on the link. For example, let's go to the about page. And you also need to put an href over here. The href is the same as in a normal A tag, where you want to put here, for example, which route do you want to go when you click on this link. In our case, it will be to the about route. And what this will do is now over here in our navbar, we have this link over here. If I click on it, it takes us to the about page. Same thing if we wanted to make one for the contact and one for the home page. I can make this into the home one and then just take it to the normal home page and this to the contact and take it to the contact page. And you should see that we can navigate between the different pages very easily using the link. Now that we understand how to set up different routes in our next application, I want to talk a little bit about some of the cool and easy things that are beneficial for you right off the bat when you're creating a Next.js app. And the first thing is working with images in Next.js, because it's a little bit different. So if we go to our page.tsx over here, this is the boilerplate code that comes with our next project, right? But right off the bat, you can see that there is an image being rendered on the screen. It's an image that technically relates to the Next.svg file that we have here in our public folder. Now, right off the bat, you can see that it's really easy to import that asset, because all we have to do is just do slash in the name of the asset. And the reason why we can do that is because even though this page.tsx file is actually inside of the app, so wouldn't you technically need to like go back twice and then go to the public? But no, because it is on the public folder, you can directly access it like this. Now, the cool thing that I was talking about is the fact that we're using an image component from Next.js. Now, what is this image component from Next image? Well, Next.js provides this component that is an extension of the normal image HTML component that you would use anywhere else. And the reason for it is because it has several optimization features. First of all, it has size optimization. This image component will automatically serve the appropriately sized images for different devices. Now, the second thing is that there is some sort of stability to it. When you have your project layout and it's shifting from different sizes, different aspect ratios, and so on, this image component will make sure that your image will maintain the correct aspect ratio as the image is loading. Another thing is that because this component uses lazy loading, every single time you use it, it is going to load extremely fast. Now, this is all locally, so obviously it is super fast. You see I'm refreshing this and the image automatically appears. But if we wanted to use an image that we have to download, for example, imagine we want to use this image I just found on Google, you could copy the image address, put it over here. And if I go back over here, you see that it doesn't actually work. So this is a common mistake people make. When you are using the image component over here and you want to pass an image that is downloaded from an external resource, such as, for example, in this case, Wikimedia, I guess it's the name of where I just imported this. Each of them, the place that you're downloading has a host name, right? And in this case, it's upload.wikimedia.org. And if we want to allow our page to download and share images or display images from this hostname, we have to specify that on our next config. So I thought we weren't going to touch the next config, but I just realized we have to, right? In the next config over here, if you want to define the different host names that you want to allow images to be displayed on, you just literally put images over here, and then you put remote patterns, and then you set over here a list to the different patterns that you might want to accept in your project. In our case, we're just going to have one. And what we do is we set a host name to it, and we just set it equal to whatever the host name was over here. Now, when we refresh this, you should see that it should be able to load that image. Now, the image looks kind of weird. It looks color inverted, but you know what I mean, right? So we just imported the image. Now, the color of the image looks inverted, right? It doesn't look like that image that we had before. And the reason for that is because in the image component, we set here by default the one, it's using invert color from Tailwind CSS. We'll just delete that. That wasn't necessary. This is the actual image. But you can see we're able to load it. Now, it does take a little bit to load. It depends on your internet speed and so on. And so you know right off the bat that images are prioritized and optimized for you every time you use this component. So now let's close this over here and let's address one of the most important topics about Next.js. And it's probably why you came to learn Next.js in the first place. And the idea is that previously when React was developed for the first time, we had the idea of creating a component by using class definitions, which is also known as a class component, right? Instead of the nowadays known as the function component, there were class components. But in 2019, I believe, I think it was 2019 or 2020, React switched to using functions instead, which was a great move. And immediately, everyone had to learn this new concept called functional components, which nowadays, if you're learning in the past few years, you don't even realize, but this was a big thing at the time. And everyone thought that it was annoying to learn functional components and the difference between them and class components, but eventually no one even knows class components anymore, and functional components became the norm. In the past few years, there has been this clear addition of a new type of component, but it's not in the same way as how a class component is different from a functional component. This new type of component is a server component, and more the React team has been making changes to adapt for the use of server components. And there are two different types of component, and a server component is essential for how Next.js works. So in Next.js, you need to know the distinction between two different types of components, a client and a server component, and they are the two types of components you're going to be using throughout your entire app. Now, they are distinguished by how Next.js will render them into your code. So if you have a client component, that component will run on the browser. It will run on the client. And if you have a server component, that component will run on the server. Now, to explain the difference and when we want to create each of them, I'll tell you right off the bat that every component we've created so far, including this one over here, and the other ones that exist already in the project, they are by default server components. So every component you create on your Next.js app will be a server component unless you tell them not to. And the way you can tell them not to is by adding here a use client tag that will turn this component into a client component. And you do that at the top of your file, so you make the entire component become a client component. Now, why does this matter, and how do I know that each of them, which one is which? Well, like I said, the client components will have this use client tag, and the server ones will just have nothing. But one cool way that you can distinguish is you can actually console log a message, right? Let's say something like, hey, is this in the server or client? And I'll do this on both the about and on the contact. And you'll see the difference between them. So let's start with the about, which is the component that is on the client, right? If I go to our inspect over here and I go to console, you see that we should see that it says over here as a console log, hey, is this in the server or client, right? Perfect. It's console logging into our inspect element. Nice. Now, if I go to the contact page, you see that it says the same thing, but first of all, it only says once, and also it says server over here. It has a little tag to indicate that this appeared in the server, right? It shows up over here, and it was something that was console logged in the server instead of in the browser. Now, the reason why when we went to the about, it console logged twice, and when we went to the server component, it console logged once, is primarily because of one of the main differences between a server component and a client component. So a server component are components that are rendered on the server, and their HTML is then sent to the client. So they are rendered at the server when you request the page, and they are never executed on the client. That means that all of the client-side stuff that React has, like React hooks, React browser interactivity and stuff, cannot exist in a server component. So this is a mistake you might make. If we go to the contact page over here, which we know is a server component, you might want to, for example, use a state, like a count state. Let's create here a simple state over here. And if I were to do this, you'll see that it breaks. It breaks because it says that you're importing a component that needs a use state, but React hooks only work on client components. To fix this, add the use client over here at the top and turn it into a client component. And all of a sudden, it doesn't break anymore. But let's keep it as a server component, and let's delete this use state. The other thing that it doesn't work on a server component is browser interactivity. So imagine if you just want to add a button, right? A button that says click me, and it will alert a message when you click on it, right? Now, still need to delete the useState import. Over here, we have this button. Nothing happens when I click on it. But what if I add an on-click to it, right? And I say that I want to alert a message saying hello. Well, this isn't allowed because, like I said, a server component is rendered on the server. It is never executed on the client. And for there to be some sort of interactivity between the user and a button, this is all done in the client. So in order to make this button actually work, we would have to, again, come over here and turn this into a client component. And then whatever interactivity you want, it would work. So you might be questioning yourself, okay, but then what's the point of a server component? You can't do anything inside of it. Well, there's a lot of benefits to it. So the first thing is the whole concept of it rendering on the server. It pre-renders the HTML, which means that when you are loading a server component, it will load the first page load a lot faster, especially for dynamic and static pages. So you get a faster first page load because it doesn't have a bunch of JavaScript that it has to download on the browser. Also, one of the main things is that since server components are pre-rendered on the server and delivered, when there are search engines like Google, and I would say Bing, but Bing isn't really used, but primarily Google, right? It's a search engine that crawl through different websites. It indexes the content immediately and grab the keywords and text that are in every website. If you have a server component that pre-renders the page and sends it, then those web engine crawlers will be able to immediately get your website's content without having to rely on JavaScript execution, which makes it extremely better for SEO. Using server components for rendering your like your texts and so on, and things that are important for SEO in your website will significantly improve how your website rank and so on. Which in comparison, client components are very bad for SEO. I wouldn't say horrible because, I mean, I've built countless, like almost 1,000 different React projects in my life. And a lot of them were before Next.js with client components. But this was always an issue with React because client components rely on JavaScript to render their content, meaning that when a search engine crawls a page, they might not see the final content right away unless the browser has fully executed the JavaScript. So your website might be lacking on keywords and metadata that the search engines might not catch, meaning that your website might not rank really high on search. So that's a huge one for server components. But you want to hear something even cooler? Well, server components allow you to make them into asynchronous components, meaning that when we define this server component over here, I could make this function be an async function. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit is if I wanted to, for example, fetch data from an API, let's see this API over here, right? It's a JSON placeholder API. I use it in a lot of videos. You can look at it online. You just make a request here and it will give you some fake data. If I wanted to make a request for this, I could literally not use a use effect because you can't use a use effect on server components, and I can just get the data. I can just say const response is equal to fetch. I need to await this fetch, which I can because I'm inside of an async component, and I could just put that data over here, and then I could just console log that response, or do something with it if I wanted to. But you'll see that when I refresh this page and I'm on the contact page, we get here the data, and then if I come over here and I just grab the posts from this and I await response.json, I can just console log this or do anything with it if I want to, and we'll get the API data without needing to put this inside of a use effect. See? We see the entire data that was returned from that API. So in server components, you can directly do fetch requests, access databases, do whatever you want without needing to bypass it by maybe creating an API endpoint and then fetching it and so on. You can do everything directly in the component. And this is really cool because it makes it a lot easier for you to do stuff like this. Sometimes I really wish I'm inside of a server component when in reality I'm inside of a client component. Now, these are the main reasons why server components differ from a client component. But you might be now asking this simple question. what if I want to have this component and this component fetches data, but it also has some sort of client-only effect, right? It has, for example, this button on click. It doesn't work, right? But I want to have both. I want to have the button on click and I want to have all the benefits of a server component. Well, the way you would do this is you would have to make two different components. And it sounds annoying, but you get used to it. You would have to, for example, come over here on the contact page and make a button.tsx. And in here, you would just export default button component. I don't know, call it whatever you want. And then I'll just say function button component. And in here, just return whatever UI you have over here. And then make this into a client component. So come over the top and say use client. Now you have access to the use state hook, you have access to the use effect hook, you have access to anything, and just call it over here because you can call a client component inside of a server component. So I'll just say button component over here, and you'll see that now we have the button, we have the data being fetched, right? And I can click on the button and the interactivity will work. Now this is great. We understand what a server component is. We understand what a client component is. We understand that to make a client component, you just add this tag at the top. We understand that by default, if you don't add that, you'll make a server component. And we also understand how to make simple basic routes. Now, we want to learn how to make more complicated routing in our project. To do that, let's use, for example, here, let's create a page called users. And this page over here will have a component inside of it. I'm just going to copy one of these components and I'm going to paste it in here. And I'll change this to users and I'll delete all of this. And for now, I'll just call it the users page. Now, if we go to our layout, we can add the new users route by just adding a new link like we've learned. And we can call this users. Now, when we go to that page, we should just see users page over here. But we will want to, for example, display the data for this API request over here. To display this data, we can make an API request to this endpoint, and it will give us a list of 10 fake users. Now, to do that, it's very simple. You go to the users component over here. You don't make it into a client component. Remember, to fetch data like this without having to use the use effect, we can make this into a server component. We make this into an async component. And in here, we can write some logic to fetch that data. Now, this is how it would look like, right? We already went over this. We would just fetch the data from the API. We would destructure the JSON response that we get. And if we wanted to display each user, we could just map through the list of users and we can display each of them, or at least each of their names. Now, why did I make this? Because I want to explain how we would go ahead and actually make another page in our app where it's for each individual user, right? I could, for example, click on this user over here and it will take us to a page that gives us information about that person. So how would we do that? Well, I'll probably want to add an extension to this route, also known as a param. A param will allow us to go to the user's route, but have some sort of variable over here in the URL that will help us render the UI in a different way. So if I wanted to get the first user, Lean Graham, this person over here, and I'll zoom in just so you guys can see it better. One way we could do this is we can get a unique identifier for this user to know that we want to render them. And a unique identifier usually is an ID. An ID is very commonly used as a param in any app. And the ID for Lean Graham is 1. So if I wanted to see her page, I could just go to users/1. And I would want to, whenever I did that, to display her information instead of just giving us a 404 saying that the page was not found. So if I wanted to make that happen, I would go over here to our project, and inside of the users folder, we would want to create another folder. And in this folder, we need to name it the name of the parameter we're going to be adding to this route, which in our case, it's going to be the user ID, or we could call it ID, whatever you want. I'm going to call it user ID just to make it easier. And you want to put square brackets around it so Next.js knows that whatever goes over here is the page for this param. Now, how do I render a component that is going to be an extension of this parameter in this route? We then create a page.tsx file over here. Now, I'll copy all of this logic and I'll just paste it over here. And you'll see that if I go to users/1, because we just copied the code, it will just show the same list as we did over here. But we now have that route set up. We can now add params to this thing, and it will actually render a route. Now, in this user ID component over here where we have the parameter, let's delete everything we have. And let's call this the user page, not the users page, just the user page. Now in here, how do we get the ID that was passed in the parameter, right? If we go to 1, how do we get that 1 to know which user we want to display? Well, in Next.js, that's done automatically through the props. You can destructure the params by setting the type of this to be equal to params, and then it will have a promise that returns whatever actual slug you used here, which in this case is the user ID, right? So we put user ID here and we say it's a string. Now, this is just because we're using TypeScript. If you're using JavaScript, you just have to destructure params. But we're using TypeScript, we have to do this. And one thing that you should know is that this params prop over here, it actually returns a promise. That's why we made this say that it returns a promise, meaning that to destructure it, what I would have to do is I would have to set this equal to await params, and I can get back the user ID. Now, if I want to display it, I can just display it over here on the screen by saying user ID, and you see that whatever the route param is, it will display in the text. Now, this isn't really useful unless you do something with it. So let's write some code to actually display the data for the user with this ID. So this is how you would do it. So in this case, I did it a little bit different from how we did it on the users page over here, because I wanted to show you guys a pattern that is common as well. If you don't want to fetch data directly inside of here, you can actually extract this and put it into a function, such as the fetch user function that we created over here. And what this will do is you can now, inside of your server component, simply call the fetch user function that you created and await the response of that, and you'll get back the information. Now, we just displayed here the data for the user, and I used a different endpoint. I used this endpoint over here, the users.id. So if that in this API, if you put the ID for 1, you get the data for that specific user, and you can see that we can display that data on the screen. Now, the code for this is very simple, but one thing I wanted to explain to you guys is that we're using the different param for each data that we're fetching. So if I were to switch this to 1, we would get the data for Lean Graham, like I said. Now, another cool thing that you can do as well is you can actually emit a not found page. So for example, if we were to go to the user, let me see, 100 and whatever, 1900, the data comes back as empty. So you'll see that our app will break if this happens, because it assumes that user is valid and there's no name on an empty user, because this API doesn't have more than 100 or 10 users. I don't know. But yeah, so you want to handle that. And one thing you can do is you can forcibly emit in Next.js and trigger the 404 not found page. The same page that would show up when you write a route that doesn't exist, you can trigger that. Now, how do you do that is we can come over here and we can say, if there's no user, we want to trigger the not found function. And this function comes from Next navigation, as you can see. And what it does is, if we were to go to a route to a user that doesn't exist, it will just render the page not found, which, by the way, we can customize it. And to do that, you just have to go to your app folder, and it's a root file similar to the layout and the page. You just create a not found.tsx, and whatever component you render over here For example, if I wanted to render this component over here, is just a more stylistic version of my 404 not found. You see it now actually applies my 404 not found for any different route that doesn't match that. And if you don't have one, then it would just default to the actually it breaks because we made the file, but if you don't make the file, it will default to the normal Vercel one. But I highly recommend you make your own, make it look nice, have a, I don't know, a UI for it. And it's as easy as just making a not found file inside of your app folder. And if you name this correctly, it will handle it perfectly for you. So you might have already noticed that in Next.js, the file naming is very important, and the folder naming is important, and the structure of where you put stuff is important. And this brings back that idea that I mentioned to you guys, that it's very easy for you to understand a Next.js project. Especially after this video, you'll be able to look at any Next.js project and already know what it is and where to find the different pieces of code, because they're all the same. And it has positives and negatives to that. I like to see it on the bright side. It is positive because I like to be able to read code no matter who wrote it. So if you're writing in Next.js code, I'll be able to read your code. But talking about specific file names, here's a cool thing that you can do. So remember here, we have this users page, right? And it fetches a bunch of users, right? And specifically, I think it fetches 10 users. If I go here to users, right, it fetches those 10 users. Let me inspect element and let me test something. If I go to the network tab over here, I can actually simulate me having a horrible internet. I can go to a slow 4G and I can refresh this page, and it still needs to make the API request, right? So it takes a while and it renders the page. Now, while the data is fetching, we might want to show a loading state. Now, how do you show a loading state? Well, if you want to show a loading state for a specific route, for example, in this case, we are in the users folder. All I have to do to show a loading state for this users route is I just have to create a loading.tsx file inside of this route. So inside of the folder that defines that route. And in here, if I want to render a component that will show that loading state, I just create a component. I'll call it loading state, something like that. And I'll just return, in this case, I'll just return a very simple h1 tag saying loading. And you'll see that when I refresh this over here, and if I can even go to no throttling over here, and I refresh my page, you see that for a brief second, it shows the loading stage while the route is loading. Now, this affects you differently with how depends on how fast you're moving to that route. But you see that when I move from the about to the users, that shows up. But it doesn't show up when I go from the users to the contact or to the about or, you know, to other pages, because I didn't set up a loading.tsx for them. If I wanted to do that, I would have to come to each of their folders and just add this. I can even add to the user ID one. And you'll see that when I move around now, it depends on which route, but actually just this one has a big issue, right? If I go to the specific user one, it will also show the loading because that one is fetching data, so it makes more sense. But yeah, this is a cool thing you can do. Create a loading file and it will show a loading stage for your route. You can do a very similar thing with an error state, but I don't think I'll show you guys just an example of it, but because you will get the idea. If there's an error boundary that is crossed and you want to render a specific UI for it, you can just make an error.tsx component, and whatever you put on that component will be triggered when there's an error inside of your route. So now we kind of understand how to build a Next.js app, right? You just make the different routes, you fetch your data however you want to, right? We obviously have a very ugly website over here that doesn't really look like a website, but like I said, this course assumes that you understand React even a little bit. So if you've ever built any website in React that has some UI, has some structure, you kind of understand this, right? I wanted to say how I would build a Next.js project in the sense that how I would structure my project, right? So I wanted to give a quick pause to the actual coding tutorial and just show you guys another project that I have a video for, by the way, on my channel. It's me building a Next.js e-commerce platform. You guys can watch it if you guys want to. It's a good learning experience. But I want to show you guys how the project for that project, like the code for that project, ended up being structured like. So I have here the project opened up. This is a Next.js project. And I want you guys to have just an idea of how you would actually end up with folder structure wise in a larger Next.js project. So we have here our page.tsx, like we've done multiple times, right? It has just a home page. We have the different routes that we have in our project, similar to how we have right now on our main project, right? We have here the about, the contact, and the users. We have the same thing on a bigger project, but the thing is, we also have other files that are outside of the app folder. So for example, if you wanted to make a components folder, which is a folder that you would put UI, right? I put here a bunch of UI components, like a navbar component. I put, this is all related to this project specifically, but you can imagine this is all UI, right? The first thing is I made them all use client, which is I made them all client components, right? Because they're not server specific, and I think they are mainly just UI components as a whole. So the reason why I put the components folder outside of the app is just because it's easier for you to organize when you are doing routing, right? I highly recommend that whenever you create your Next.js project, you put your route folders in the app, but any other folder, like the components folder, like the store folder over here, which in this case is just for state management, like if you're using the context API, or in this case, I think I'm using Zustand. Put that all outside of the app folder so it's not confusing, right? It's not confusing that you have a checkout page, which is a route, and you have a components folder, which isn't a route, right next to each other, right? Also, it's very common for you to see this lib folder in a Next.js project. So a lib folder, usually in a Next.js project, is used for storing utility files, shared logic, library functions, and so on. So in this case over here, I'm using a bunch of stuff, right? I'm using Stripe, I'm using Prisma, which is a database management library, and so on. And if I'm going to create clients for them, if I'm going to create things that just need to be exported and used in multiple files, I'll make a file in the lib folder, and I'll just import it from here later on. So this is all personal, just like how to structure a project, but I think it would be a good interjection for me to just show you guys real quick what I would do and how I would structure a Next.js project. Now, there's a couple other ways in which people are familiar with structuring their projects. So that's why I don't want to go too much into detail, because this is all personal, but this is an example and I think it should give you guys an idea. The last concept related to routing that I want to talk about is the idea of layouts. So you have seen over here that we have a layout for the project, and I've explained that in a Next.js project, a layout is basically this component that defines what the UI that goes around a group of routes. So we have the main layout over here, right? The layout.tsx that appears at the root of your app folder, and whatever route you're in will be rendered inside of the children, allowing us to put some sort of UI around it, like a navbar, or if we wanted, we could put something below it as well. As long as it's around the children over here, you'll see that the UI is going to appear outside of the route, and whatever's in the middle is what is going to change. If I go to the about, the navbar appears at the top and at the bottom, and so on. So this is the idea of what a layout is. But from what you guys have learned so far, you only learned of the main layout. Now, you can actually implement layouts no matter where you are. You can implement layouts on individual segment of routes. Now, let's look at this users route over here, right? This is a group route, meaning that it has two routes that are inside of each other, right? There's the user ID route that uses params to differentiate it, and there's two different files for them. If I go to users over here, you see this is one route, but also if I went to users 2, it would be another route with a different UI. Now, what I can do is I can create a layout on this users folder by calling it layout.tsx. The name matters again. And in here, I can export default function, and I can call this the user layout.
And what this will do is it will act the same way as this main layout file over here acts, but only for the user's route. So in here, we can extract the children because the children is important for us to actually be able to render the UI dependent on the route. For example, I can define here that the type will have a children, and the children type has a React .React node type if you're using TypeScript. And in here, I can return some sort of UI that will appear on all of the user's route. So I can say something, for example, an h1 tag here. I'll even give a style, and I'm gonna say the color is red, just so you guys can clearly see that this is different from the other ones. And I'm gonna say this is a user route. And what I want is to, below this, render the children. Now, by doing this, you'll see that no matter where I am, if I'm in a user route, it doesn't matter if I'm in the main user route or if I'm in an individual user route, you'll see actually 23 doesn't work because it's not a route. We don't have 23 users, but you see on user 2, this UI will appear, including if I were to create, for example, another route over here. Like if I were to create users / I don't know, friends, right? And then make a page.tsx here that is export default function friends. Imagine that this is just some sort of UI, right? I'll actually just return an h1 that says, hey, friends. So this is now a different route. And if I go to users / friends, the UI for friends appear, but also the layout appears. So you can make layouts for individual route groups. And this is very useful, especially if you're working with very nested routes, because it makes your life a lot easier. Perfect. We've learned a lot of the core concepts of Next.js, but here is something that if you've never worked with Next.js in the past, you'll definitely think is insane, which is in Next.js, you can build your own backend logic directly within your application. So instead of having to set up a separate server with API routes, using something like Express.js and creating routes that define endpoints that handle HTTP requests, you can actually do all of this inside of your Next.js project. The way you do that is through API routes. Now, API routes are used normally to interact with databases, external services, and to, for example, handle form submissions. Now, in Next.js, they're going to be very similar from how you would create your own backend endpoints in a traditional server. But there's an added convenience of you having it directly integrated with your frontend. Now, I've shown you guys that in a Next.js server component, you can directly fetch data like this because the component can be asynchronous. You can even actually, if you have, for example, a Postgres database, you can interact with the database directly in the component. But you can also do that in its own API route. And the way you create an API route is through the API folder. So in the app folder over here, we're going to create a folder called the API folder. Now, this is going to have the same file-based routing structure as the rest of your Next.js project. So if I want to create a route inside of here, I just have to create a folder inside of this API folder. For example, let's start with the easiest one, which is just a hello world route, right? If I want to make a endpoint that is going to be called through the /hello route, I have to create a folder called hello. That's the name of the endpoint, right? Now, instead of creating a page inside of it, when you're working through the API folder, you name the endpoint with the folder name the same way, but the name of the file is actually route. And you make it a TypeScript, it's not a component, it's just a TypeScript or a JavaScript file. Now, inside of here, if I want to define an endpoint for this route, you have to define what HTTP method you want to handle. And you can handle all of them, right? You can handle a get, a post, a put, a delete request, whatever you want. Now, the way you handle those types of requests is you export an async function with whatever method you want to handle. In our case, let's go with the easiest one. Let's do a get request. To make a get request, you literally call the function get on all caps, and this will know that it is returning a GET request. Now inside of here, we have to return some sort of response. Now the way you return a response is through the next response method that you can import from Next server. And we want to return some sort of JSON response. So we'll use the .json method. And in this case, let's just return an object that has a message that will say hello from API. So this is just a GET request that returns this. We can actually test this very easily. I mean, we can curl this, we can make an API request to this, but also we can just go to /API/hello. And you'll see that it is making an API request. This is what it looks like when you make an API request on the browser. And we are getting the response that we got from that GET request. So you're seeing that it is running on the server and we are actually making this GET request. Now to make a POST request, we'll do something extremely similar, right? We'll just change this to POST. And now it will know that this is a POST request. Now, from a POST request, usually you can get other types of data. More specifically, you can get a request. And a request, you can access it directly from the arguments of this function. And you just set the type of this to request. Now, inside of this, to get the request, whatever we're getting back from this, you actually have to use an await to get back the data. So we can say something, for example, imagine that in this POST request, all I'm doing is I'm just sending a name through this request body object over here. And through that, I'm just going to return back a message with that name in the message. It's very simple because the point of this video is not to explain how to make API endpoints. I'm just showing you guys how to do this in Next.js. So to do that, we would have to pass through the body a name, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get back the data and I'm going to await request.json. This is going to give us back the data. And I can destructure that data directly like this. Assume we're going to get back a name. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return back a message. And in this message, I'm going to include the name. So I'm going to say hello, whatever the name is. This was sent from the API. Something like this. Now, how would we call this? Well, to call this, let's go here to let's go to the friends component. This is let's go to this one. And let's imagine here we're going to have a function. Now, this function, it is going to be a function that is going to make the post request. So let's make here an async function called I don't know, make post request. I think this is a bad name for a function, but you guys get the point. This is a function that all it's going to do is it is going to make a request through the fetch API, and it's going to make a request to our post route over here. Now, how do we access this route? Well, all you have to do now is just say /API/hello, because this endpoint is on the hello route on the API folder for our project. Now, because we have multiple types of HTTP methods in here, we need to specify what kind of request this is. So I'm going to give a method of post. I'm also going to give some headers to specify that the content type is application /JSON. Now, we also want to pass a body to this. So I'm going to pass here the body to this request, and I'm going to JSON.stringify the name. And I'm just going to pass Pedro. Then I can return whatever the response. Actually, I'll just get the data. Let's say const data is equal to res.json, and we need to await the response from this. So we can await from it, and I'll just return the data directly. Then inside of this component, because it's a server component, I can simply get back the data by setting this equal to await make post request. And I need to make this into an async function, right? And what I can do is I can just say, hey friends, and then just render whatever the data returns. We need to see here, there's a message. So I'm going to say data.message. And what we should see is that actually, if we go to the friends route, now let's check to see if this worked. And it didn't. Now, the reason why this didn't work is because of a common mistake when you're starting to build with Next.js and using API routes, which is the way you make API requests to your own API through a server component and a client component is different. When you're in a client component, you could make an API request like this because the relative path to your actual API, like definition, makes sense in a client component. But in a server component, it doesn't work because when you are server-side fetching, it will expect the full defined URL for you to actually fetch that data. Meaning that even though we have the path over here, we need to put the full URL of our website, which in our case would include the local host 3001. So what I like to do is I like to come over here to my .env, .local, and then I would probably make something like next URL. And I would create an environment variable for it, which would be whatever my URL is. So in this case, it's 3001. And when you deploy, obviously, you would change this to whatever your domain is. But then you would come over here to where you're making this request. And what you would do is you would insert that value in here. And the way you call environment variable in Next.js is the same as always. You just say process.env and then you put the next URL name, and now it is making the correct request to the correct endpoint. You'll see that if we go back over here, now it is sending the body object that we put, so Pedro, right, as a name. But if I change this to Jack, now it would be something else, and it is making the correct request. So this is the idea. It is a bit different from when you're making a client component. If this was a client component and we're putting this request on a button or on a, but let's actually do this. I'll actually show you guys this. If I make a button here, let me make an on click over here, and when we have this on click, all I want to do is I just want to call this, and to do that, obviously I'll make this an async, and I want to make this into a client component. And to do that, we'll come over here, we'll turn this into a use client, right? And then what I want to do is I want to create a state called message, right? Because this is a client component, we can create a state. So I'm going to say set message, and I'm going to set this equal to use state. And it's going to be just an empty string. But when we get back this data, we're going to set the message to data.message. And in the meantime, we'll just render the message. Now we'll also make here a button. I'll just put it on the on the H1 just for now. And let's call this request when we make when we click the button, right? So I'll pass this on click over here. Now, when we do this, I'm gonna open this up over here. Let's open our network tab. Let me click on this. You see that it doesn't work. It says page not found because we are in a client component, and in a client component, you don't have to put the URL. And in reality, this is what you have to put, because if I click this now, you see that it actually makes the request. So there's a difference between when you make a request on a client and in a server component. And this is something that a lot of people miss when they're learning Next.js, either because it doesn't really explain on the documentation or because tutorials don't actually go in depth about this. But this is basically it. This is how you work with API routes in Next.js. And I think this is the end of this topic, and it leads us to the final topic I want to talk about, which is the topic of metadata and SEO. So in Next.js, one of the main benefits, like we've mentioned multiple times in this course so far, is the fact that it is very beneficial for when you want to rank high in search engines. So it's good for search engine optimization, also known as SEO. And one of the great things about it is how easy it is for you to set metadata for the different pages you have on your app. So normally you would set metadata onto your head tag over here on a meta tag, right? So in your HTML definition, you would have a head over here, and you would put metadata inside of it. Now, with Next.js, metadata is managed in a declarative way using the metadata property that exists in every single page.tsx file. And we've seen it already happening on this layout.tsx, which, by the way, it also exists on a layout.tsx file. And here it is. And this property is how we can define different parts of our metadata for each individual route or layout. For example, if I want to come here to the About Us page, in this page, if I export the metadata constant from this component, and I make sure that this isn't a client component, because if it is a client component, you can't export and define metadata. In here, whatever I put here will be part of the metadata for this page. So in an About Us page, for example, it might be good for me to put a title for it that is like About Us and then name of website, right? And then a description, you can put a lot of keywords here. You can also add keywords as a tag directly here. So this could be about, company, mission, AI, SaaS, I don't know, whatever keywords you think matters. And you can do a lot more. You can put your actual social media accounts. You can control how this specific page is displayed when, for example, is shared on Twitter or on Instagram. For example, with the Twitter, we can set a Twitter tag over here, and we can define how this card is displayed. We can, for example, say that it has a summary with a large image. And what is the title of this when it is sent or shared on Twitter? We can put here, About Us, Twitter, I don't know. But yeah, you can define metadata, and we can do this for every single page. And I highly recommend you doing this if a page is a server component. Like this one, this is a server component. You obviously have to import the type if you're using TypeScript, and so on. So this is the concept of metadata, and it is a very important one. Now, one single thing I want to mention is just that there is the global metadata that you set on the layout, and this is globally defined for every single page on your app. So it's very useful when you want to apply metadata to multiple pages. You just apply it on a layout, and you apply it to the layout. So this is the main, the global metadata that you have for your website. So if you're going to make a project with Next.js, highly recommend adding metadata on every single server component. So this is basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. If you are interested in checking out my new React.js course for beginners, go to the link in the description or go to react.pedrotech.co. And if you use the code early100 and you're one of the first 100 people, you'll get 20% off. Now, I'll continue making this course with time. So if you're watching this in the future, I'm still improving this course. I'll never make a new React course again. This is my last course. Also, it will never be cheaper than what it is right now. So I highly recommend you just checking it out. And if you vouch for my style of learning and you want to improve your skills and learn React in a different and more in-depth way, check out that course, because I put a lot of effort into that, and I'm going to be adding some new modules every week. So thank you so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed it, leave a like, comment what you think of the video, and I see you guys next time.